Hello, welcome for our series of lessons in science. We are going to look at the weathering and sedimentary rocks. From today's lesson, we are going to discover various processes of weathering. But before that, have a look at the environment. There are various landscapes that have changed with the time. And this change may go unnoticed in the lifetime of a human being. Some of these changes are very little and sometimes they are negligible. They cannot be identified very quickly. And some changes that occur in the landscape, some of them occur dramatically. For example, during the storms or during volcanic eruption, earthquakes and storms may modify the environmental landscape suddenly with a dramatic effect. But also most of these change, they happen due to the physical and chemical changes, and that is where there's a destruction of landscape that occur as soon as it is formed. Therefore, weathering is the term that is used to describe this type of phenomena on Earth crust. Then, what is weathering? We'll have to look at weathering in itself. What is weathering then? Weathering is the mechanical breakdown or the chemical decay of rocks in situ. Weathering is the mechanical breakdown or it may also be chemical decay. The chemical decay of rocks in situ. This one means the mechanical breakdown or the chemical decay of rocks on Earth's surface may happen in situ. That is without any movement. They may not have any movement, but they're just breaking down or without moving. Therefore, this phenomena is going to be exposed, especially the mechanical breakdown of rocks, under some special agents. There are so many agents that may activate this process, and the agents that make weathering process to occur include water. We have various agents such as water. We also have ice. We have some weather elements. We have some of the weather elements. And some of these weather elements include temperature. We will have to look at the rainfall, even wind to a given extent. Those are weather elements that may contribute to the weathering processes, among other agents such as we also have plants and human activities. Human activities. These are the agents that may trigger or may activate the process of weathering. Let's look at types of weathering. Types of weathering. There are various types of weathering on Earth's surface, and this type are normally discussed in various level, but we are going to look at them into details. One, we have the physical weathering. Then two, we have, that is the chemical weathering. We have the chemical weathering. And then the third one may involve biological weathering. That is biological weathering. We shall look into details about the aspect of physical weathering, chemical weathering, and biological weathering in details. Let's begin with the physical weathering. Physical weathering. Physical weathering involves the breakdown of rocks into smaller fragments without changing their chemical composition. And this one may happen in various processes or various action that may work out on the physical weathering. And one of the action that cuts across that may trigger out physical weathering is the temperature variation. Temperature variation. When you look at the temperature variation, most of the time during the day, temperatures on Earth's surface tend to be relatively higher compared to the temperatures that are on Earth's surface during the night. Now, during the day, you'll find that because temperatures are relatively higher, what happens? The rock absorbs heat as a result of the high temperature, and as they absorb what we call the heat because of the sunshine, they conduct that heat, and then the rock themselves, because they are a solid, they do what? Expand. And during the night, the rock may lose out the heat, and therefore they may contract in the process because of the chilling or the cooling temperatures, because temperatures have varied, and therefore they contract. That is the process of expanding and contracting or contraction of rocks, periodic or repeated, may bring up what we call physical weathering. And that one happen because the expanding and the contraction repeatedly of rocks, it may create what we call the cracks or the crevices on the rock surface. Those cracks or the crevices on the rock surface are the point of weaknesses where rock may strain and then begin to break down in the process. Now, as a result of the temperature variation, we learn that rocks are able to expand, and when they lose out the temperature, they contract. The process of expanding and contraction may lead to the rock surface creating what we call the cracks or the crevices, and in the process they strain and therefore break away. That is, the rocks may begin to break down or disintegrate. They break down or they may disintegrate into various fragments as they peel off. That is much more about physical weathering. Now, let us look on the next action that may also trigger of physical weathering. We have looked at the temperature. We also have another part, that is part 2, is the frost wedging. Frost wedging, or sometimes we call it the frost action. We have frost wedging or frost action, and this one happens during the rainfall, the high rainfall on the earth's surface. The water rainfall may be collected in the rocks and in the rock crevices, and then during the cold nights the water freezes, and as it freezes it expands, and then during the day, because it is very hot, the same water expands or melt away and expand into the crevices, and then it makes a repeated action of freezing and thawing. It makes a repeated action of freezing and thawing. This action of freezing and thawing in the rock crevices is the one that is going to make these rocks to be disintegrated into various angular blocks of rocks, especially in mountainous region. When we look in mountainous region where there is an action of frost, let's look, for example, in Africa. There are various mountains in Africa, like Mountain Kilimanjaro. What happens during this process? We may have the rock surface on mountainous area, and then some crevices may be created. Some crevices or the cracks are just created on the surface of the rock. This one represents a crevice, and therefore during the rain season, the water may be collected in the crevices, and then it freezes. As they freeze, you will learn that, or will be able to see that it may create the stress ice is formed, especially during the night, and then as it forms, there is what we call stress will be built up, and therefore in the long run the crevice, this is water has accumulated in the crevice, and then it forms what we call ice. When ice are formed, the ice may melt during the day and freezes during the night. Therefore, in the process, it will enlarge this crevice. Will have an enlarged crack on the rock surface, and then eventually it may make this piece of rock to be expanded and cracks further, and therefore it peels off, and it breaks into various pieces, especially in the mountainous region because of the frost action. For example, we have been able to look at the Mount Kilimanjaro, that is in Africa. We also have the Rwenzori mountain. In Australia, we also have some other mountains there, such as the snowy mountain. In Australia, we have the snowy mountain, and this one is found in the South Wales of Australia. We also have another one, is known as the Victoria Alps. Victoria Alps. It is found, it is actually having 1,986, that is kilometers above the sea level. Oh, it is not kilometers, it is meters above the sea level. And then we have the Townsend Mountain. The Townsend Mountain is found at 2,209 meters above the sea level. And then lastly we have the mountain Kosciuszko. The Kosciuszko mountain, which is 228 meters above the sea level, which is raised to that point. We have been able to look at the process of frost wedging in action, and we have learned that it happens in the mountainous region where there is an action of freezing and thawing periodically happening in the crevices of the rocks, especially in the mountainous region, therefore making the rocks, the surface rocks on the earth, to be peeling off or disintegrating or breaking down into various pieces. We have the abrasion. Abrasion is also a process that occurs when rocks rubs against each other, and this involves the chipping and the breaking of rocks into smaller pieces during their physical weathering. You will find that these happen in areas where we have glaciers. These happen in area where we have the glaciers. Happens in area where we have glacier, or in the area where we have glaciation. And also in the stream beds where the sediments are carried down by the glaciers, they rub against each other, and in the process they break themselves into finer particles. And that one is the process of abrasion. And eventually those small finer particles can also be carried down by the streams of water, and sediments are deposited in various places. That is much more about abrasion as the third process of physical weathering. Let us look at biological weathering. Biological weathering. Biological weathering occurs during the action of living organisms such as plants and animals, including also the activities of human beings. For example, the plant roots may grow bigger into cracks of rocks, And as they grow bigger, they widen up into those crevices. In the long run, the rock is stressed up, and in the process, it will be wedged off in a mechanical action, because when roots create pressure in those crevices of the rocks, they may create wedging action, which may increase the gap or the crevices between the rocks. And therefore, some also may involve the burrowing animals, or we also call them the rodents. They may dig up the crevices of the rock slowly by slowly, and eventually the process in the long run is complete by a biological weathering. We can also have large animals such as elephants. Using their hoofs, they trample on the surface of the earth, that is the crust or rocks, and that one may lead into the disintegration of rocks into smaller and more smaller particles on Earth's surface. Let us look, for example, on the chart. Now, when we look on this chart, we are able to look an incidence of biological weathering. Therefore, this is a representation of plants and how they work on the rocks. This is a tree, and when the tree grow up, the roots also grow and elongate themselves deeper into the rock surface, so that they are able to tap water. Remember the essence of these roots, they are searching water into the deepest part of the crust, and in the process they may meet rock surface, the crust of rocks along the way. And as a result of that, what will happen? The roots are going to create pressure, and that pressure is going to make the rock to crack further into pieces. In the process of that, we are seeing the rocks are breaking away. Rocks will be breaking away. At the same time, in the same crevices, in the crust of rocks and soil, we'll have some small animals. We call them the burrowing animals, such as the rodents, like the squirrels. They may also be able to burrow slowly and slowly into the soil, and therefore immediately as they meet the crust of rocks surface, they release some organic substances such as acids, which will eventually continue with the process of breaking down the rocks into smaller pieces, and that is what you call biological weathering. We will move on and look at the chemical weathering. Chemical weathering involves various also processes, where we have the chemical weathering. Chemical weathering also involves various processes. From the word chemical, we will learn that this one involves a lot of chemicals. And because it involves the altering of the composition of the mineral, which are found in the rocks, the altered chemical may also not hold the rock surface, and so it makes the rocks to crumble due to the chemical reaction following various processes. And there are various processes that are also involved during what we call the chemical weathering. Like one of the processes, we refer to it as oxidation. oxidation. This one involves, or it occurs where oxygen from the air or maybe the dissolved substance such as water that act on the surface of the rock, this one produce a completely new substances. For example, when iron in some rocks is converted in the process of oxygen, iron as an element of rock, in the process of oxidation, where it is converted with oxygen, it may lead into the formation of a brown, what we call a brown substance that we call it rust. Chemically, we will look at iron reacting with oxygen. Iron is reacting with oxygen to form what we call iron oxide. This is the iron oxide, which is referred to as oxygen, or which is referred to as the rust. This is what we call the rust, is a substance that is formed in the process of oxidation. It is formed in the process of oxidation, and therefore this is a chemical process that involves oxidation. And eventually, as it works on that, you remember that the iron has been oxidized in the presence of oxygen to form a rust, which is a brown substance that is totally different from the original iron. And that makes it more important for us to understand the chemical weathering in oxidation. The process, the other subsequent process that may follow is referred to as carbonation, or the addition of acid. Carbonation is the process that occurs especially when the rainwater percolates through into the rocks. It carries with it some dissolved gases such as carbon dioxide. This produces a weak acid into the rocks, and this acid becomes stronger when it continues to percolate deep and deeper into the soil, because it may meet some other acidic substances, for example, the organic substances that may be found in into the soil. And when it eventually meets with the limestone rock, it produces a different chemical change of what we call the process of weathering. For example, when limestone reacts with a weak carbonic acid, it may form calcium hydrogen carbonate. We are looking at the limestone. With weak carbonic acid. That one will form what we call hydrogen carbonate. And the reaction may take place in a different manner. Limestone, its chemical name is calcium carbonate. And when it is reacting with the water, which has formed the weak carbonic acid, it will lead to the formation of calcium hydrogen carbonate. This is also another chemical reaction under what we call decarbonation. That means when the acids are added, for example, into the limestone areas, the weak carbonic acid react on the limestone, that is calcium carbonate, to form a newly different rock, that is calcium hydrogen carbonate. This has a different characteristic with calcium carbonate, which is the limestone. And in this process, you will learn that as the chemical proceeds or continue to percolate into the earth crust, carbonation process still continues, and as it meets with the crustal rocks into the earth's surface, it continues to wear them down, and eventually they disintegrate in the process, and that is breaking down of those rocks. Lastly, we will have to look at hydration. We have hydration as a process of also chemical weathering. When we look into the hydration, hydration occurs when the hygroscopic minerals in rocks have absorbed some water and making them to swell and therefore expand. Such minerals such as clay, they may change their structure in the process. Therefore, the repeated action of absorbing the water molecules, expanding, and during the dry period, the water is lost through evaporation. It also creates another process of hydration, that is expanding and contracting of especially rocks such as clay. In the repeated action, it may cause rocks to disintegrate and therefore causing the weathering process to be complete in a chemical format. When we move on in the humid region, especially where we are able to see the process of carbonic that happens, in the long run, it creates on the surface what we call disintegration of rocks, and when those rocks break down, they are going to form slowly by slowly. We are seeing the breaking down of these rocks are going to form soil. And before, when soils are formed, therefore, there will also be another process that will be taking place. And that one is erosion. We'll be able to look into what we call erosion as also one of the aspects that now act generally on weathering. We'll have to look at the erosion. We are able to understand that in the process of weathering, the weathered materials sometimes are recycled so that they are able to form the new landscape. Therefore, what is erosion? Erosion is the movement of the broken down material that are in dissolved material, that is especially the particles. They are moved from one place to another on Earth's surface. For example, material had been found at point A, and then it's being moved and therefore deposited at point B. This process of moving these particles, the weathered particles, from this point up to point B is what is referred to as erosion. And therefore, erosion may be carried out using various agents. This also process depends on agents, various agents of erosion. These agents include especially water, and we'll also be looking at wind. These are most powerful agents that may propel the process of erosion. For example, water in its nature is a powerful force because it generates a force in forms of the currents as the water moves in the streams of river. They carry out both large boulders as well as the grain materials which are formed from the rocks, which are withered down from the rocks, and therefore they are deposited down in various places, especially in lagoons or along the mouth of a river, maybe in the ocean, and also the estuaries. For example, let's look at River Murray in South Wales. We have the river called River Murray. That one is found in the South Wales of Australia. This river, I hope you understand that the river has a length of 2,508 kilometers long. When this river is having some water, you will find that the weathered materials in form of boulders and fine particles could easily be carried down along the river. And as they flow into the stream, depending on the stage of that river, when the river reaches a point and therefore the speed reduces, that one may also make the river to begin to offload whatever particles or boulders it had carried. Therefore, it makes what we call deposition. Therefore, the particles or the boulders that had been carried down the streams into the river, they are going to be deposited on the other end along maybe it can be into the ocean or the estuary, and that one makes erosion to be done in such a manner. There are various types of erosion. There are various types of erosion. There are various types of erosion, and we will just mention them. We have gully erosion, the one that happen in the gullies. And then we have the real erosion. We'll have real erosion. Then we will also have sheet erosion. And finally, we have splash erosion. These are the various types of erosion over which the weathered materials may be transported from one point to another. For example, when we look at the gully erosion, Gully erosion happens where there is a deep gullies and it carries the materials which will be transported down, and it leaves behind a gully. Therefore, in the process, the material that have been scooped down or they are just transported along this area, we refer to them in the valley, in the gully erosion. While real erosion occurs creating rills. Rills are just some small traces. Now, for example, this is where water is passing through, and as water moves through down, it may leave behind some furrows. We call them rill. Therefore, this is what we refer to it as the rill erosion. We also have a look at the sheet erosion. Sheet erosion involves massive erosion that occur on Earth's surface, especially sweeping a large area, and the materials or the particles that are found in that area, for example, soil, may be resulted into the sheet erosion and therefore completely sweeping that area, especially along the river banks. That process occurs and is completely happening along in that area. Whereas the splash erosions, let us look at some drops of water maybe are coming from the rooftops, and as they land on the earth's surface, especially on the crust, we'll be able to find there are some fine materials, there are loose and unconsolidated materials that are found here. Therefore, when these drops of water, maybe from the rooftops, periodically lands on this ground, eventually they will create a depression here, because there are some some rock particles or soil particles will be scooped out in the essence, and therefore making that area to have a depression like on the earth's surface. That is has happened under the process of the splash erosion. That is much more about when water is involved. What about the wind? Wind also carried the withered particles. The wind, especially in dry areas such as the desert environment, wind wipe up those particles that are carried out for some longer distance before they are dropped. And as they blow along, they hit against each other and they sandblast them, and therefore they deposit them down the stream in form of very fine grained fragments. We call them the lows. We are looking at the wind. When wind, as an agent of erosion, especially in a dry environment such as the desert, it may wipe out, the wind may wipe out the particles which are carried over a long distance. And before they are dropped, as the wind is carrying away those particles along, the particles will hit against each other and they sandblast them into very fine deposits, and then eventually they drop them in the sediments. We call them the lows. And some of these sediments that are referred to as loess, they may also be in the process of forming what you call silt, and that is where there is silt formation, silt and clay. Now that is the soil will be formed in the long run or in the process. That is much more about erosion working with the agent of wind. Lastly, we'll look at the glaciers, which also work in this process. We have glaciers. As already I had mentioned, glaciers, glaciers are formed during glaciation. And a glacier is a large mass of ice that especially is formed and may float on water bodies. Therefore, during erosion, the rivers, especially in the glaciated island, they carry out erosion, leading to the formation of the U-shaped valleys. As they form the U-shaped valley, the debris which are now being carried along the glaciers will therefore wither down into smaller fragments by the process of plucking and abrasion. They will be broken down into smaller fragments in the process of plucking and abrasion, and this process also may aid in weathering and therefore leaving behind a U-shaped landscape, which is known as a U-shaped valley, especially in glaciated highlands. We'll be able to have such features that are formed, and that is how glacier also act or aid the process of erosion, leading into the formation of other landscape and features. Therefore, we'll also be look at the gravity. Gravity also influences the process of weathering, the same time the erosion. We have the gravity. Some materials may be moved from one place to another under the influence of the gravity. And the force of gravity is evident in various places on the Earth's surface. Such materials may be moved in form of landslides, the rock slides, mud flows. They occur under the influence of gravity. For example, we have the landslides. Landslides occur to form what we call a downward or an outward movement of rock debris, such as sand and pebbles. They are moved from one point to another. And in the process where they move, they cause dramatic effects on the damage of the property, and sometimes it may lead to the loss of life. Like yesterday in South Africa, Freetown, it was reported there was a landslide, and it occurred as a result of the Earth's surface being saturated with water. The Earth's surface has been saturated with water. Remember, these are the rock debris. They are weathered down and they just are found on Earth's surface. And then when the Earth's surface is saturated with water, that means there is excess water in particular areas, especially during the heavy rain. The ground or the Earth's surface will be saturated with water, and therefore lubricating those debris. And these debris are very loose. They are in loose and unconsolidated material. And because of they form as a syrup of a mixture of the debris plus water, they make them, because on the depending on the topography of the land, they may easily flow from the high place to the low place or to the lowlands. And it is also found out that there are some areas where the landslides move a distance of between 20 to 30, that is 30 meters per second. Such speed is very high, and especially depending on the slope of the land. When it moves in such a high speed, when landslide occurs, the adverse effect may be felt. Especially, we will have an experience on our properties being damaged, and sometimes it may lead to that. For example, in Freetown, South Africa, it is reported around 204 people lost their life. They were buried in landslides. That is an effect of erosion in form of landslides. Let's look another part. We'll also have the rock slide. Sometime during the earthquake and other tremors, the crustal rocks are shaken. And because after the weathering process, there are rocks debris that are just broken down either chemically or physically. Some are broken down as a result of the human activities, such as the heavy machinery or bulldozers working on earth crust. They may break down the rocks into smaller pieces and they left them on a heap. Therefore, looking into the topography of the land, the rock slides occur, causing the rock to slide more in a combination of the gravitational pressure and the excessive water. It leads to a massive rock slide, leading to another process that is referred to as mass wasting. And this is the process that we refer to it as the movement of the rock materials or the debris down the slope under the influence of the gravity. And we will have different movement of what we call mass wasting. There are those movement of those debris that move very slow, and there are those movement of what we call mass wasting that are rapid. They are affected by several factors, such as the topography of the land, the nature of rocks, and the slope of the land. These three aspects may affect the rate of mass wasting in form of what we call the rock slides. Lastly, we look at the mud flows. Mud flows. You see, gravity here is playing a vital role in various movements. We have what we call mud flows. The mud flows happens in mountainous places along the dry season, especially let's focus in the desert region where there has been a dry season, and then abruptly it is followed by a heavy rainfall. What happens? During the dry spell, there are loose and unconsolidated materials. They are found in the desert environment, such as the sand, fragments of pebbles, and other debris. But immediately when rain comes, there is excess water. Therefore, those materials are mixed with water, such as ash, soil. We call them the hydrothermal material. Hydrothermal. We look at the soil, and then we have ash, and then it is mixed with water. They form what we call a hydrothermal material. And this material, depending on the slope of the land, it is going to move in a mass that we call it mud flows. And as it sweeps down into the valley, it drains into the lowland. As it drains into the lowlands, it forms what we call layers. In the process of mud flow, we have found out that in various areas, the regions of the world where mud flows have occurred, when there are no vegetation, during the hydrothermal process, the mud flows occurs at a very rapid movement of mass wasting, and therefore the effect will be felt and will be more hazardous on the environment, including damaging of the physical properties, and other human being may lose life, because mud flows have ever been witnessed over the world. In regions where they have occurred, they may bury even children or even human being down into the valley or into the slopes because of their habitation. That is much more about weathering. We have been focused on weathering today, and we have been able to look at various processes of weathering. We have been able to look at three types of weathering. That is physical weathering, we have chemical weathering, and we have biological weathering, playing a bigger role in this part, with also erosion. And lastly, we have been able to look at the mud flows along other subjects. I would like to give you to write out this question as we wind up. 1. Give the meaning of weathering. And then 2, state types of weathering. State types of weathering. And then lastly, you describe 3 processes of chemical weathering. describe 3 processes of chemical weathering. Having looked at these 3 questions, you'll be able to communicate to us in the email platform so that we are able to know if you have grasped the concept of weathering. We shall meet in the next lesson when we'll be looking at sedimentary rocks. Have a good day.